Now we're going to introduce learning as a particular area of interest in psychology. A lot of what we're going to look at has got some historical perspective in terms of understanding how we learn. And yet, that historical perspective has had a profound impact on understanding how we make sense of the world around us and how we continue to learn. It applies to both, your primary school, your elementary school, your high school, your post-secondary, your job, all through your life. Learning is going to be a part of that. So let's go and explore learning. Now, by definition, learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior, knowledge, capability, attitude that's acquired through experience. Now, that's an important piece there. Learning cannot be attributed to illness, injury, or maturation. Now, maturation is just the normal, natural development that we go through as human beings. Like, for example, an infant don't learn how to walk. Instead, the basic motor skills and the maturation govern every species. So as much as we say, oh, Johnny learned how to walk, Johnny would have learned how to walk or gained walking regardless of any instruction anybody would have given. That's just part of a normal development based on body capability and maturation, or getting older. That's why there's milestones in childhood development. If you have had a young child at home, when you go to your doctor, there's checking for different milestones of what they were doing based on their age. It's because these things normally happen regardless of any instruction. That's not what's considered learning. Learning is through experience. So let's explore this a little further. Now we're going to start with one historic view of classical conditioning, which is a type of learning whereby an association is made between two previously unrelated things. Now, during classical condition, a neutral stimulus, like a tone, a buzzer, is presented shortly before an unconditioned stimulus. In this case, we'll say food. And the unconditioned response is salivation. Now, the important thing here is unconditioned. It means you didn't learn it. Food didn't automatically produce something. The unconditioned response to the presentation of food, this is in Pavlov's day when he was working with dogs, he'd present food, the dog would salivate. So the food is the unconditioned stimulus, the thing that is presented. The response, which didn't get taught, was salivation. The tone, well, we're calling that the neutral stimulus because if you have a dog that's never heard a particular sound, it doesn't have a particular learned response to that sound. It's neutral. So after repeating pairings, that is, we're pairing the tone with the food, the unconditioned stimulus, the tone, by itself will elicit the conditioned response, the salivation. So the tone becomes something that when you put the tone on, the dog will start to salivate. So the dog has learned that the tone will bring about food. So classical conditioning is a form of learning in which an association is formed between one stimulus and another, creating a learned response through these associations. The good, the bad, the what we like, desire, value, and the choices we tend to make are a result of our learning. A stimulus is any event or object in the environment that we directly or indirectly react with or interact with. So let's look at this a little more carefully, and I'm going to go through a bit of this so you can sort of get the idea. Now use your textbook. It's going to be helpful in this as well. The unconditioned stimulus, it'll be referenced as US, unconditioned stimulus, is the stimulus that is naturally occurring and produces the reflex or involuntary unconditioned response, the UR. Now both are called unconditioned because they are not learned. For example, food, a loud noise, light puff in your eye, light in your eye or a puff of air in your eye. These are all unconditioned stimulus. And the salivation, the startle, the contraction of your pupil and to the light, and the eye blink response are all unconditioned responses. You don't have to learn to blink your eye when someone puffs air. You know when you go and get your eyes tested and they do that little puff of air, you can't help but blink. It's unconditioned, you didn't learn it, and the puff of air is the unconditioned stimuli. You don't normally have to present that and learn how to respond. So the conditioned stimulus begins as a neutral stimulus, but when it's paired with an unconditioned stimulus, eventually it begins to elicit the reflex on its own. The reflex response to the conditioned stimulus is called a conditioned response, CR. And both stimulus and response are learned. So let's look at some of the strategies or ways that you can use this knowledge. If we look at generalization, this is one of those ways. Other stimuli similar to the original produces or elicits a response similar to the conditioned response. So for example, to generalize, I can put on my white pair of socks in my bedroom, but I can generalize that skill to put on my black socks in the living room. So the skill of putting on socks has been generalized to not just the color, but also to the location. Discrimination is the response to some things and not to others. And this is an important distinction. Discrimination often gets misused in the psychological use in the field of learning. Discrimination, you go shopping and you want to pick out fresh tomatoes. So you go to the tomato area and you look at all the tomatoes and you select some and you ignore others. You do that, it's known as discrimination. You're picking out some that fit your description of what is a good tomato. And you're ignoring or putting aside things that you don't think are. You're discriminating. You do a multiple choice test. You read the question, you see the 4 possibilities. You have to use discrimination skills to select what you believe to be the right answer. So this is learning to respond to some things, the right answer, and not other things, the wrong possibilities. Extinction, well, this learning lessens the CR, or the conditioned response, in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus over time. I will use in an example coming up around seeing the sign for Tim Hortons and getting this urge to have a coffee. Now, extinction would be to lessen the conditioned response, see the sign and get a coffee, that if I don't see that sign for a while, I drive in other parts of the world or go to the US where there's no Tim Hortons and I don't see it, that link for me might start to wear down over time where I see it and I don't necessarily need to go for a coffee. That would be extinction. Now, spontaneous recovery, this is when the conditioned response can occur after a long delay and even without further conditioning. Okay. Now, along this timeline of learning about learning, John Watson initiated an experiment to prove that a child could be classically conditioned, just like what we've been talking about. This was done in 1919. With an experiment with a young lad named Albert, and they used this as a hallmark experiment. They call it Little Albert, where he was conditioned to fear not only a white rat, which is what he was trained and through conditioning and association, but it generalized to include other white fuzzy animals like, bunnies and cats. So, conditioned to be afraid of white rats and other white objects. That's conditioning. We can teach a lot of things. And so that was the fear response. Now, for example, if we use the fear response, you could use the dentist for many people as an example, where the smell of the office, the sound of the drill, the sight of the chair can produce an associated response of an, oh my God, I'm about to, be killed. That's a fear response that's learned through an association. Drug use is another good example. The conditioned stimulus is associated with drug use, and it leads the individual to seek out those substances. One of the bigger reasons that people who quit drugs or alcohol and then find themselves slipping back in, it's more psychological than it is physical. It's because they've gone back to the same neighborhood and maybe they see things that for them trigger those associated memories, and so they go into that bar or they go to that house and they get and connect with those conditioned responses. Advertising is a great example. A neutral product is associated with people, objects, or situations that consumers like, and therefore it elicits a positive response. Like how many people may have bought a watch because Brad Pitt was wearing it. Doesn't tell me anything about the quality of the watch, but maybe I like Brad Pitt, so if he's got a watch that looks like that, I should have one too because I like Brad Pitt. Association. Now, operant condition, this was introduced by B.F. Skinner, and it's a type of learning in which the consequences of behavior are manipulated in order to 1, increase or decrease the frequency of a response, or 2, shape an entirely new response. So let's look at some of the features associated with this. A reinforcer, this is what the consequence is, and that follows a response and strengthens it, increases the probability that it's going to reoccur. So one of the first things you need to know about a reinforcer is anything that when you do it, it increases the likelihood that what you reinforce will be increased. And I used that a lot when I was a behavior consultant, that if a parent or a teacher was unhappy with the behavior of a child, but that behavior of the child was increasing, then something had to be reinforcing it, because behavior doesn't go up unless there's a reinforcer, because it increases the probability of it reoccurring. And so the big trick is to figure out what's the reinforcer, and sometimes it's not at all what you think it is. So we're going to look at primary and secondary reinforcers as well as reinforcement schedules a little bit further along here. Now some operant techniques. For example, one of the ones that you've probably been more a participant in than you can imagine is what's known as shaping. And this consists of gradually molding a desired behavior or a response by reinforcing any movement in the direction of the desired response. So what's meant by that is that you gradually respond and are guided towards the ultimate goal. You know, we learned how to write this way in print. You know, we did small approximations. We learned how to, you know, with dotted lines around the letter and shape and train around the lever. How you make a bed, you learned it a bit at a time, and you were reinforced for doing little bits of it, and then eventually you did the whole thing. Shaping is a very common approach to teaching animals and humans skills. Now, along with that are what known as successive approximations. These are a series of gradual steps, each of which is more similar to the final and desired response. Parents shape their children by praising them each time they show improvement, and so progressively they, through successive approximations, learn to do something completely. You may have learned to cook your first meal by doing close approximations. A child may learn to set the table by doing a little bit, getting praised, doing a little bit more, and getting praised some more, and eventually doing the whole thing. Circus animals have learned feats. Pigeons learn how to bowl and play the piano. Dogs learn how to help people who are blind and have other disabilities, all through successive approximations. Now in operant conditioning, there's also extinction. This is weakening and the disappearance of a conditioned response as a result of withholding reinforcements. So if every time you smiled at me I gave you a donut and you really liked it, and then I wanted to extinct that behavior and I don't give you a donut anymore, eventually you wouldn't smile at me. Generalization, the tendency to make the learned responses to a stimulus similar to that for each of the responses that was originally reinforced. A pigeon trained to peck a yellow disc will peck simultaneously colored discs if it's reinforced to do so. The less similar the color, the lower the rates of pecking will be. And then, as was mentioned in classical conditioning, there's the discriminative stimulus. This is a stimulus that signals whether a certain response or behavior is likely to be rewarded, ignored, or punished. Children misbehave with a grandparent because the discriminative stimulus, the parents weren't there. So sometimes grandparents get a harder time with children than the parents did. Okay, we're going to look at a few things here now. and make sure we understand them carefully or accurately. Positive reinforcement will be the first. Any pleasant or desirable consequence that follows a response increases the probability that that response will be repeated. There are roughly the same as a reward, essentially. If you smile as you walk down the street and some people smile back at you and say nice things, you might want to smile at everyone as you're rewarded for this, and it's a reinforce, and therefore increase the likelihood that you're going to do it again. Now here's the one that most people misunderstand, and that's negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is often misunderstood as it does not mean how many of us, does not mean punishment, and yet how many of us use this inappropriately. Negative reinforcement means the termination of an unpleasant condition after a response increases the probability of that response being repeated. I'll give you an example and I'll walk you through a few. Turning on the air conditioning to avoid heat, getting out of bed to turn off the leaky faucet, these are negative reinforcements. The sound was the negative reinforcement. You got out of the bed and turned it off, you corrected it, everything's okay now. That's not punishment. You're hot and you put the fan on, you're cooling down because you're hot. That's not punishment. Heroin addicts will do almost anything to get another fix to avoid the pains of withdrawal. The pains of withdrawal are more the punishment. The get another fix is to correct that. So negative reinforcement isn't generally what we think. Okay. Here is a study issue example of negative reinforcement. Now, if we look at what is a primary reinforcer, there's primary and secondary. Primary reinforcers are reinforcers that fulfill a basic physical need for survival and does not depend on learning. So food, water, and sleep would be considered primary reinforcers, whereas secondary reinforcers, these are acquired or learned through association with other reinforcers. So we've learned the value of money, praise, or applause. These are learned. They're not basic human survivals. And so that's what makes them secondary. And we should be using more of the secondary when trying to do so, with children in particular, but not exclusively. Now this next section here is on schedules of reinforcement. Schedules of reinforcement determine which responses will be reinforced. And there's a variety of ways to look at this. Now there's continuous reinforcement. This is where you reinforce every single example. Continuous. And then there's partial. This occurs when correct responses are reinforced randomly or intermittently. So you don't do every one, but you do maybe every third one, or you do a random selection. So let's look at the variability of these. We're going to start with fixed ratio. This reinforces after a set number of responses. Every third response gets a reinforcement. Every fourth response gets a reinforcement. These are fixed ratios. Variable ratios are reinforcements given after a varying number of correct responses. These are not fixed, but vary over that length of time. Fixed interval, and we're going to make a change here now. Fixed interval reinforces first appropriate response after a fixed amount of time. So maybe I create the fixed intervals to be every 5 minutes. The first time I see this good response in that 5-minute period, I reinforce, and then no more reinforcements until the next period of time. Variable interval, this case we are reinforcing the first appropriate response at a variable amount of time has elapsed. So in this case, instead of them being fixed every 5 minutes, maybe it's 5 minutes, 15 minutes, 3 minutes, 30 minutes, and the first time that it pops up in that period of time, I reinforce it. Here's a little skill set or a little thing to remember. If it's ratio, it's number of responses. If it's interval, it's talking about time. So ratio, number, interval, time. All right, that's a quick overview on the schedules of reinforcement. Now I'm going to touch on this quickly and just go over it quickly, and that is punishment. Punishment does not extinguish an undesirable behavior. It suppresses the behavior when the punishment agent is present. That just means that punishment doesn't eliminate a behavior, it just means it's not there while the punishment is going on. And in some cases, for some people, punishment can become the reinforcer. If my yelling at a child every time they do something wrong becomes the reinforcer, it's not surprising that I spend a lot of time yelling at my child because they've learned that that's the reinforcement. Being a positive reinforcement from somebody, desirable, is not based on your condition, it's based on what works for them. Punishment indicates that a behavior is unacceptable, but does not help people develop a more appropriate behavior. So behavior just takes away something, but doesn't replace it with something more appropriate. Punishment should use in conjunction with reinforcement or rewards for appropriate behavior. A person who is severely punished often becomes fearful and feels angry and hostile towards the punisher. May be accompanied by a desire to retaliate, avoid, or escape from the punisher or punishing situations. Punishment frequently leads to aggression. May model aggressive behavior. Children of abusive, punishing parents are at greater risk than other children of becoming aggressive and abusive themselves. So we need to be very conscious of how and when and if we use punishment as a strategy. Escape learning. This is performing a behavior because it prevents or terminates an adversive event. Taking an aspirin to avoid a headache is escape learning. Avoidance learning, well, this is engaging in behavior to avoid an adversive consequence. Coming out to a dinner table when mother's voice reaches a particular pitch is avoidance learning. I avoid the consequence right at the right time. Now, something I've done some experimenting with in university is what's called learned helplessness, a passive resignation to adversive conditions learned through repeated exposure to inescapable and unavoidable adversive events. Humans who suffer painful experiences they could not avoid or escape may simply give up or react to disappointment in life, trying to becoming inactive, withdrawn, and depressed. Now, one thing I'd like to spend a little bit of time on, again, just a little bit of time, is what's known as token economy. Token economy is a form of reinforcement scheduling whereby behavior is reinforcing with tokens that can be exchanged for desired items or privileges. Poker chips or coupons are given when a patient grooms correctly, does chores, or interacts socially in appropriate ways. Positive behavior may stop when tokens are not given. So you set up a schedule by which here are the conditions in which you get tokens, and here are the conditions in which tokens won't be given. And the goal is to reinforce appropriate behavior while not rewarding inappropriate behavior. Now, a strategy that sometimes gets used, which is questionable about its value, is what's known as timeout. A misbehaving child is removed for a short period of time from the sources of positive reinforcement in an attempt to extinguish the unwanted behavior. Now, what's important about timing out is to do it correctly. And this is not the environment in which to learn it. This is psychology and looking at learning, and so I'm highlighting some of the topics. But if you're using timeout, I would really seriously consider making sure that you know what you're doing before doing it. You might be surprised what you're reinforcing. Now, learning by observing the behavior of others and the consequences of that behavior, well, that's an important element about imitation, and often involves imitation. Now, there's some elements about imitation in social learning that's important here, and that is modeling. It's another name for observational learning. Improved learning when several sessions of observation precede and attempts to perform the behavior, repeated in the early stages of practicing the behavior. So modeling is about really watching giving an opportunity to practice and to imitate, and to get times to repeat it, and having been reinforced for having done so. Now, one of the things that's key about modeling is having a model. A person who demonstrates a behavior or whose behavior is imitated is considered the model. And we often see this in the way that we have learned. If you've learned a particular skill, often there was somebody that you watched doing it so that you could replicate what was being done. All right, that was a quick overview on learning. I hope it's been helpful. Use your text and keep up the good work, everyone. Bye now.